Now, Tyndall doesn't do a very good job of describing this, and it's admittedly quite a bizarre scenario. But let me explain just how paranoid the Federalists were. When they looked at the Louisiana Purchase, they were so concerned about the creation of all the possibility of these new Western states, which would truly tip the balance in favor of the South, in favor of slavery, that they wanted to really balance out that power. So as you get 1803 and into 1804, a group of sort of extreme Federalist congressmen plotted to create something known as the Northern Confederacy, which would consist of New Jersey, New York, the states in New England, as well as Canada, and it would basically break off from the United States. It would become its own country. Now, of course, these Federalists went to Mr. Federalist, Alexander Hamilton, and said, would you lead this group? And of course, Hamilton said, no, I care about the United States. I'm not for this. So they go to Burr. Aaron Burr is the vice president under Thomas Jefferson. And basically the deal is that if these Federalists help Burr get elected the governor of New York, Burr will actually bring New York into this Northern Confederacy. But Burr is badly beaten, in part by Hamilton's opposition, outspoken opposition against him, saying this is a very dangerous man, don't put him in control of anything. And then ultimately, angry Burr will challenge Hamilton to a duel in which Hamilton is killed, and Burr, who at the time is still vice president of the United States, takes off for the South, where he will ultimately try to lead another sort of secession plot later on that I may or may not get to. Now, a quick side note on Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr was the last vice president elected before they had the 12th Amendment. And again, in 1804, you're going to have the 12th Amendment, which basically says that members of the Electoral College would vote separately for president and vice president. So you'd never end up with this awkward situation like we saw in 1796 with Adams and Jefferson, and then in 1800 with Jefferson and Burr, where the first place person becomes president and the second place person becomes vice president. Now we're going to switch our attention abroad and look at conflicts between Britain and France. Again, we've seen conflicts with Britain and France in the 1790s. We're going to see it in the early 1800s. And in this case, we're not necessarily going to be able to avoid war forever. So we will end up in war in 1812. So how do we get there? So after the Louisiana Purchase, Napoleon declares war on Great Britain. We saw that coming. That was one of the reasons that he sold Louisiana for so cheap and with such urgency to the United States. Now, the French army is actually quite powerful, and they control most of Europe. And the Royal Navy of Britain is quite powerful, and they control the seas. So you've got this sort of on land, on continental Europe, the French are really powerful, and on the seas, sort of outside of continental Europe, the British are most powerful. So Britain declares something called the Orders in Council, which said that no one could ship anything to continental Europe, especially the United States. And Britain begins seizing American ships that are bound for France. Now, again, we're finding ourselves right back in the issues of the 1790s, with our ships and their cargo getting seized and our sailors being impressed. Now, the dilemma was, if the United States agreed with the British demands to stop trading with the French would retaliate by seizing U.S. vessels that are going to Great Britain. But if we agreed with the French demands and we stopped trading with the British would seize our ships. So at the end of the day, we're sort of damned if we do or damned if we don't. And many American shippers were like, you know what? We stand to make so much money if we can actually get our goods there that they're going to take the risk. But at the same time, they really put themselves in harm's way. More harm was coming from the British, who were impressing American sailors, kidnapping sailors, and often claiming, well, we have a right to do this because they're British. So we're going to find ourselves right back in the situation that we had leading up to Jay's Treaty back in the early 1790s. Now, we have a specific incident that we have to think about in terms of impressment, and it's called the Chesapeake Leopard Affair. Now, there's a British warship, the Leopard, that stops a smaller U.S. ship, the Chesapeake. You can always remember the Chesapeake is the American one because the Chesapeake was in America. And it's about 8 miles off the Virginia coast. And the Chesapeake captain, again, says to the British, you cannot board the ship. You cannot come look for deserters here. British oftentimes stopped American ships and said, we're looking for deserters. And oftentimes there were deserters on those ships because the British treated their sailors so badly that they oftentimes wanted off their ships. And when the when the American captain says no, the Leopard opens fire and kills 3 Americans, on an American ship and wounds 18, then boards the ship, seizes 4 men, one of whom is hanged for being a British deserter. Now, what's important is this is an act of war. This is not just taking people off a ship. This is killing people on a ship. But it's crucial to understand that much like Washington and much like Adams, Jefferson thinks to himself, I cannot have a war. We are not in a position where we have the leverage to even fight in any war. So he only demands an apology. That's sort of officially what he asks for from Britain. He also bans all British warships from American waters to the extent that the American Navy can even do that, and calls on state governors to mobilize their militias. So again, even though that there is technically an army, it's very small, and states all have militias. Now what we have are called National Guards, where you can basically call up state troops, but that's the closest you get to war. And Jefferson doesn't go to war, in part because the U.S. Army is tiny. There is a Navy, but it's pretty small as well. They're not prepared to fight at all. It's important to note what Jefferson does do, seeing as though that he has very little power militarily. He calls for what is known as the Embargo Act, and it's important to understand the term that was used, peaceable coercion, namely trying to use the only leverage that we had, which was economic leverage, to try to get these other countries, particularly Britain and France, to stop treating our American ships and American sailors so badly. So the goal was to cut off all American foreign trade, and the thinking was if we stop all trade of American goods, wheat, flour, pork, fish, cattle, to other nations, that they would actually quit violating American rights. Now, you have to understand this. All America had was their trade. And so, again, going all the way back to what we saw, in 1765 with non-importation agreements to Britain, it says, maybe we can get you to stop by playing the only card that we have. Now, interestingly, neither Great Britain nor France looked at us and said, oh, well, we're going to stop because you've cut off trade. They were more powerful than we were. So they sort of laughed at it in a way. But it not only didn't achieve what it was supposed to achieve vis-a-vis Britain and France, it was really harmful to the American economy, particularly because in New England, it damaged the value of U.S. exports. That's where exports are generally coming from, is that area. Shipbuilding, which has been part of New England going all the way back to, Mass Bay in the 1630s. And on top of that, crops, which would have been Democratic, Republican supporters, agriculture in the West and the South. They can't ship their stuff because they ship their stuff on American ships, so their crop prices are going to go down. So really everybody is hurt. Federalists, Democratic, Republicans. And there's sort of two bits of irony here. One of which is that with Thomas Jefferson saying we're not going to import, we're not going to export, we're going to have this embargo, no foreign trade, it actually sort of jumpstarts American manufacturing in a way. Not huge scale manufacturing, but because goods aren't basically coming in, America's got to figure out how to make stuff on its own. Again, the irony is that Jefferson had never really wanted manufacturing. But perhaps the bigger irony is that Jefferson, again, the states' rights guy, don't want a big, powerful federal government. He has to take extraordinary federal power into his own hands to enforce such a far-reaching economic embargo. Now, in the end, this embargo is so injurious to the American economy while achieving nothing diplomatically that it's actually repealed by Congress unanimously on his last day in office. So in comes sort of the second in command Democratic Republican, James Madison, and he's committed to staying out of war as well. So Washington keeps us out, Adams keeps us out, Jefferson keeps us out, and Madison is going to try. And Congress is going to pass something called the Non-Intercourse Act. So first was the Embargo Act, that didn't work. Now they're going to have the Non-Intercourse Act, which is basically going to say, we're actually going to trade with everybody else, but just not with Great Britain and France. And then the hope is going to be that that will force them to start treating us well. Well, neither Britain nor France, again, see any value in that. And so Congress is actually going to pass something called Macon's Bill number 2, which Tyndall doesn't mention, which basically says whichever opens up trade with us first, Britain or France, they'll be our friend and the other person will be our enemy. Well, France looks at the situation and sort of like, well, we have nothing to lose by taking the bait, and they said that they would trade with the United States. So now that's the choice. France is going to be our friend. Well, Madison turns to Great Britain and says, you have 3 months to do the same. Well, Great Britain's like, we don't need to do this. We are still way more powerful than you. So at the end of the day, after Great Britain refuses and the British Navy continues to take U.S. ships and cargo and impress sailors just like they've always done, you're going to see a declaration of war. And the Federalists, especially those in the Northeast, don't want a war. They don't want to create any more problems with Britain because they need Britain really for their economy. The people that do vote for it 80% of the Republicans down in the South and Western states, they are the ones that are for it. Now, the Republicans in power, Madison and in Congress, had hoped that this war would bring the nation together. Again, there had been so much fighting truly between the parties going all the way back to the 1790s. What's interesting, they want to both unite the nation, but they want to discredit the Federalists, so they want to make sure that sort of that Federalist Party is powerless. And they finally want to put an end to the British and the Indian attacks. They want to end impressment, and they want to end attacks out west. Again, I know that sounds like the precedent for Jay's Treaty, which never really came to fruition at all. So you find yourself in this War of 1812. And actually, sort of prior to the War of 1812, sort of leading up to it relative to some of those, sort of Indian attacks out west, we have to talk about two Shawnee men. They were brothers, or actually half-brothers. Tecumseh, who is the military leader, and Tenskwatawa, who is his brother, who is known as the prophet, and he's sort of the religious, spiritual leader. And together they'd hope to create a single Indian, unified nation that could be unified to fight against white encroachment. Again, it's a classic step number 7. And they tried to form alliances with other tribes and tried to say, listen, they're taking our land, they've signed these treaties, they've broken these treaties, steps 4, 5, 6. And William Henry Harrison, who will later become president, as well as his grandson Benjamin Harrison, who will also be president, he's the governor of the Indiana Territory. And he tries to negotiate with Tecumseh, and clearly he figures out that it's not going to work. So he says, I'm going to eliminate him. So he brings about 1,000 troops and goes to a place called Prophetstown, which is on Tippecanoe Creek. If you're driving to Indianapolis today, you would see it. And when Tecumseh, the military leader, is away actually recruiting, soldiers, Harrison gets Tenskwatawa to fire first, and there's a very bloody battle of Tippecanoe, and it's a brutal defeat for Native Americans, and will later give William Henry Harrison the name Tippecanoe that he will use to run in the election of 1840 as Tippecanoe and Tyler II. Now, the types of people that really are pro-war that come from the West and the South, we know them as war hawks. And they want to seize Canada from the British. They see an opportunity for more land. They want to get the British out of Canada. They also want to control the fur trade, so they've got some economic ideas there. The people that we associate with the Warhawks, two terribly ugly guys. One is Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. Now, New Englanders and much of sort of New York didn't want war because, again, they didn't want anything else that was going to harm their shipping. So they looked at the Embargo Act and thought this was terrible. They thought a war would be even worse. And so during the war, you have Massachusetts and Connecticut that refuse to send soldiers to fight in the war. We're going to see something similar that happens in the Mexican-American War when you have Northeasterners known as conscience Whigs say, there's no way that we can support something that is clearly sort of, a war for more land for slavery. Some merchants even sell supplies to British troops in Canada. There's even some people that are known as blue light federalists who allegedly hung blue lanterns to help British ships come to shore to help them get there. Now, when you look at what's going on during the war, you've got some real problems that make it hard to fight a war. Part of it is that you had the Bank of the United States had been chartered from 1791 to 1811. That 20-year charter is over. So as soon as you have the national bank is done, you're going to have a number of unregulated state banks, basically banks that sort of pop up and they put out all different types of currency, and that currency leads to inflation, and you have total financial instability. We're going to see that happen actually a number of times in United States history when we don't have a POTUS. You're also going to, of course, be facing the British naval blockade, which we've seen before. They are the most powerful navy, and because goods can't come in and out, the federal tariff revenue goes down, which creates more economic problems. Now, as we head into sort of looking at our troops versus their troops, which is always going to be a problem for the United States, the British have 250,000 troops in the most powerful navy in the world. The United States has just barely over 3,000 poorly trained troops led by incompetent officers with no combat experience. They have a slightly bigger navy, but they still only have these 16 tiny gunboats that I told you were called Jeffs that can't do much compared to 600 British warships. So this war should not go very well. And I know there is something in the reading questions that says describe the three different fronts of the war. I apologize for leaving that in. It doesn't need to be there. You don't really need to know the three different fronts. You really just need to know what happened in the Chesapeake. Again, that sort of Virginia, Maryland, D.C. area. And I'll get to that at the beginning of the next lecture.